You that don't know me, I've been guiding full-time here for about 24 years on the Space Coast, and I've been doing radio show for about 21 years. I did a show for Florida Sportsman Magazine called Florida Sportsman Magazine Live for 10 years, and then the following 12 or 11 or whatever it is now, I've been doing my own show called Catch a Memory Outdoors, and we do that every Saturday morning from 7 to 9. Like Kara was saying, we're going to be doing a live remote here on the 17th prior to the Boaters Exchange Boating and Fishing Expo that's going on that day. But tonight I thought I would talk a little bit about tarpon, so give you guys a little bit of an insight on what I do when I'm going out there and trying to, take my charters out there and put them on some fish. It's supposed to be. It's not on? Oh, it's mic'd into there? Okay. I'll just talk louder then. How's that sound? Tell you what I'll do. I'll even come on the other side of the table. So what we're going to talk about is the type of gear that I use to start off with, and that way you guys can all say, okay, I've either got that or I don't have that, and if you don't have that, run down to Strike Zone and pick it up. They've normally got about everything that you could ever want down there. If you are looking for some of my rods, there's a couple of these rods left out at Sunrise Marina, the larger ones, but I've got a 7'7" memory stick rod that is built for 20 to 40 pound class tackle. So it's a 20 to 40 pound class blank. And being 7.5 or larger, it allows you to throw longer distances. And I really, really like to be able to throw long distances, especially in the case of tarpon, because it seems like a tarpon school isn't just from here to that Everglades boat wide. A tarpon school is from here to Southern Pine down there wide, and 3 times that long. There's a lot of area that is incorporated into a quote-unquote tarpon school. It's more of a loosely associated grouping than it is actually a school of, like you would think of a school of bait fish, like a school of mullet. They spread out a lot. Now, if you find them tightened up, real tight, we're going to talk about that scenario later on, and that's a really cool scenario to find. But most of the time when you're running up and down the beaches, or even in the lagoon systems, there's going to be there's going to be a fish here, there's going to be a fish another 20 or 30 yards, there's going to be a fish another 20 or 30 yards. They stay within contact of one another, but they don't swim right next to one another in many cases. There's a few exceptions, but for the most part, they're fairly well spread out. So having a longer rod where I can cast a long distance and cover a lot of water whenever I come upon a school really makes a big difference as to whether or not I'm catching fish or not catching fish in many cases. One of the things that I like to throw, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go on to stick with the gear. So we've got a 20 to 40 pound class rod. We've got this reel is about an 8,000 size reel. I either run the Saragosas or I run some Okumas. They've got a Cedros that's a really nice reel that they came out with this last year. And it's about half the price of a Saragosa, and so far it's holding up just as well. So I've been pretty pleased with it. But this is my workhorse. I've had these reels for about 4 years, and for a reel to last me more than 2 or 3 years, it's seen its dues. It's paid its dues. It's seen some time on the water, and if it can hold up, then I stick with it. And the Saragosa is one that you can definitely say that about. I run typically a 30 to 40 pound braided type of a line on my spinning rods, and the reason that I do that is a spinning reel typically has a lot more flex to it, inherently has more flex to it than a trolling type reel does, and so there's a little bit of flex there. You can get away without having the flex in the line, which like monofilament or fluorocarbon line will have some stretch to it. This has no stretch, but it's got some shock absorption in the rod, so I'm not really concerned. I'm more concerned with being able to make a long cast and then detect a strike at a long distance, and the braid allows me to do that, as you guys know that use braid. To that, now this particular leader is a piece of 50 pound fluorocarbon, so I go from my 40 pound main line to my 50 pound fluorocarbon, and I only have that in place just because I just need a little bit in there. I don't need a long one, I just need a little bit in there to then attach to this swivel. I don't like to attach braid straight to a swivel. I don't know why. It's a weird thing. I don't know if it's mental. I don't know what it is. I just don't like to do it. I like to put a piece of clear leader in front of it. I don't like the colored line, the colored braid, being that close to my lure. Now, in this case, I didn't take this off today because I just wanted to show you this swivel, this 250-pound piece of mono, and the crimps that are holding it together. You can catch tarpon on this, but you're going to catch tarpon on this in a surf casting scenario. Okay? So you're going to be standing in the surf, or you're going to be just outside the surf throwing into the surf. And you'll find two scenarios where you'll find the tarpon in the surf. One is when they've got the glass minnows pushed all the way in there in the springtime, or in the fall time when the fall mullet run is going on. You find them in that turbid, more dirty water. And so you can get away with heavier tackle. All of the rest of the year, with the exception of when they're on mudding bait pods. And I'm not talking about greenie pods, I'm not talking about pilchard pods. I'm talking about pogey pods that are actively twirling mud and creating mud plumes, and the tarpon are in them. Then you can get away with this heavier tackle. If the water has no mud in it, or you're not casting into that rolling surf type scenario, then go lighter. I've been using this for sharks the last couple of trips, so that's why I've got this tied on here. It will work, but don't build this for yourself. What you want to do is you want to build a piece of 50 to a piece of either 80 or 100 at about that same distance. You need about that much 80 and about that much 50. And what that allows me to do, it allows me to pull that knot up into my guides and then cast it back out. If you have an 80-pound or you have a swivel there, you can see it does not want to go in. And that's too short a leader to tie, like I was saying, to your main line. So those are the reasons that I build the 50 to 80 to my lure. And that's really all the distance you need. You don't have to make a super long leader to make it happen. Anyway, the other thing that I want to talk about is chuggers, skittering type plugs, even subsurface, lures, like this super shad wrap as an example. I like to take the back treble hook off especially when I'm targeting tarpon. But any big fish, jacks, king mackerel, snook, you can catch plenty of fish on a single hook. But tarpon get hooked up on a single hook much better than they do on a treble hook, and stay hooked up better than they do on a treble hook most of the time. So I put a single on the back and I leave the treble on the front, or I take the treble completely off. So that's my casting gear. And the big chuggers, if you're working over top of a bait pod, especially a muddy, boiling pogey pod, great way for them to be able to pick out your lure, because you're making this huge, gigantic chugging noise. And it's more like a fish just came and struck right there, and then the other fish will come to see if he damaged any other bait fish. Maybe he didn't get the bait fish, maybe he just stunned it or wounded it. You'll see that a lot when you're catching bluefish, when you're catching ladyfish, when you're catching jacks. The other fish, even trout and redfish sometimes, you'll see the other fish chasing the hooked fish because they see he's got something in his mouth and they want to take it from him. They think, oh, I'll get that little piece that he's going to drop out of his mouth. Or if there's a strike, a topwater strike, a lot of times you'll see other fish come to that strike. And so tarpon, sharks, all of those do exactly the same thing. So I like these big chuggers to be able to make a lot of commotion and then have a big profile that the tarpon can pick out and then strike real easily. So that's my spinning rod. Is any questions on that particular gear? Okay, let's talk about the other thing that I use. I also use a conventional reel, and I found the best reel ever. And I've been searching for a long time for a good tarpon reel, and it's been tough. It's been really tough. I've burned up a lot of reels. I've lost a lot of fish in the process, and I finally found a reel, and it's made by a company called Okuma. And it's not a very well-known reel, but it's actually a lever drag that also has a level wind. And guys are like, oh, well, level winds will break. Well, that reel's 3 years old now. Level wind's been working on it just fine. It's been through spinner sharks, It's been through 30-pound jacks. It's been through, 100-pound black tips. It's been through 100, 150-pound tarpon. It's been through everything that I can throw at it, and it hasn't broken. So in my book, that's a win. And it's called an SLX 10L. And the SLX is for Salterra. I don't know what the X stands for. The 10 is the size of the reel, and then the L is for level wind. They make this without a level wind as well. But the one with the level wind has been holding up really well for me. So here's the benefit to this. I can pull it all the way back, and I can put it in free spool, take my collector off. I can put it in free spool to let my baits out. Or if I get a strike, I can go back and I can drop back to the fish. Completely drag free, just completely free spool. Then I can, as soon as I feel the pickup, I can immediately go back to my strike drag and I'm engaged. I'm at the proper amount of drag that I want to be at that particular time. And in this case, it's about 6 to 7 pounds of drag pressure. Now, later in the fight, whenever that fish is getting tired and we want to put a lot of heat on him, put a lot of pressure on him, and he stopped jumping, turning back flips, doing front flips, twirls, everything else that tarpon do, then I actually can push the button and go over strike a little bit and add a little more pressure to a maximum of about 18 pounds on this particular, the way I have it set right now. You can vary it with any lever drag. You can vary the amount of drag that is being put on through the drag quadrant simply by the detent that you have out on the side here. You just adjust this preset and then you can engage it. So I can back this off so that my strike is only 2 pounds if I want. But I can tighten it back down and I can make my strike whatever my strike is at that point, probably 18 or, right at 18 or 20. But the way that I typically set it, like I had it set, it typically is right at about 7 pounds at its strike, and then over strike goes to 18. Now I'm using 30-pound mainline. So theoretically, I should not break the fish off based on what the drag setting is. Even if I go to max drag, even if I push all the way over and go to max drag, I shouldn't theoretically break him off. But I don't recommend doing that because you know how tarpon are. They're hard enough to catch. They'll break anything that you throw at them just about anyway, so don't give them an excuse to do that. But to just go slightly over strike and add 12, 13 pounds of pressure onto that fish where you were only at 7 before, you get that fish's head coming, you get him turning, and you can whip that fish much more quickly. So that's why I like this. Now you ask me, why do I like the lever drag versus a star drag? Here's why. Hold that. Lift up on it. Get both hands on it, and yeah, there you go. Lift on it. Okay, can you do that for 15 minutes? No. Okay, right? No. And he's a big, strong guy. Look at the guns. You know what I'm saying? You can't beat a tarpon physically. You have to beat a tarpon mentally, okay? And the way you do that is you beat his will. He thinks he's getting away. He's one of the biggest, strongest, baddest fish out in that ocean. You have to trick him into thinking that he cannot win the battle. So when that fish is on that lighter drag to begin with, and he's turning cartwheels and backflips, and he's running here, and then he's running over there, and he's jumping, and he runs around the front of the boat, and you look like you're doing the tarpon two-step around the deck trying to keep up with this thing. Once he settles in, then you hammer him. You put the drag to him, right? Now it's a whole different scenario. He had free reign of movement wherever he wanted to go with just a slight bit of impedance. Just enough to tire him down, but not enough to pull the hook back out of him. Now you lock down on him and he's like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm trying to swim and I can't go anywhere. And now I'm being pulled backwards and I can't move. Now, he will jump 1 or 2 times when you first do that. So we do what's called bowing. Okay? You've heard bow to the king, bow to the silver king, right? Tarpon are called silver king, bow to the king. So bowing, people think, well, I'll just drop the rod tip. Okay? I prefer to call it stabbing, because if I'm fighting the fish and he's decided he's going to come up and he's going to jump, I'm going to stab my rod right at him. I want to drop my rod tip down, bring it back into me, and then reel, okay? And the reason I want to do that, the guides are all on the top of the rod. If you drop and throw slack to him and you get that line to loop around that tip, and then you come back up and come tight against it, you're popping him off just like that. End of game. So by stabbing, dropping, and then bringing it back in and reeling it down, the line can only go towards the fish. It can't go across the blank or across the guide. So that's the big key that happens at about the 12 to 15 minute mark in the fight, because he's done all of the acrobatics that he's going to do for a while. He's tired now. So now you put the heat on the fish, you get up close to that fish, he's going to jump 1 or 2 more times, you're going to stab at him a couple of times to keep him from breaking you off, and that fish is basically going to roll over. And you can beat a tarpon, you can beat an 80, 90, 100 pound tarpon in 15 or 20 minutes using that technique. Now, you are going to have to pull. If you're just standing there holding the rod, you're not pulling. You know, you're going to have to actively be battling this. It's like hand-to-hand combat. Imagine locking up with somebody and you're going to go into a wrestling match. You've got to be ready. Same way with a tarpon. If not, then you're sitting there for 45 minutes or an hour, because he will absolutely get his second wind, and when he gets his second wind, you're done. You don't have a second wind, okay? You're done, and that's how long it's going to take. If you don't beat him in 20 minutes, it's 45 or 50 or an hour. So the choice is up to you. I don't recommend tarpon fishing unless you may want to get out and do a couple laps around, walking around the block, maybe hit a couple of push-ups. You still got a month or two before they get here in good numbers. But you really want to be physically fit to be able to do this. There's very few times that you're going to land that fish without being physically strong enough to do it. Yes, sir.
And while you're talking about that, bowing to the king, if you lock that drag up with one hand, you may lose that whole setup, the whole rod and everything, right?
Yeah.
So, like you said, best not to lock it up.
Right. So that's a great point. So with this type of rig, you can typically beat the fish a little faster than you can with a spinning rod. It can be done with a spinning rod. It takes a little more, you have to be a little better skilled angler. With a conventional reel, you really don't. You just have to have everything go right, first of all, and you have to be physically strong enough and do the drag at the appropriate time to whip that fish, and you can do it. Now, here's the last thing the reason that I started using lever drag is that on a star drag reel, the star is right here, and you click it 2-3 times forward and it gets tighter. You click it 2 or 3 times back and it loosens up. So that's great that they have detents on them. They used to not have detents on them, so you didn't know. But here's what happens. So you're sitting there, you're sitting on I've got a little chair that I typically have on the front of my boat. You're sitting there on the front of the boat and you're fighting it. And unfortunately, we're in minute number 47 because we weren't able to subdue that fish at first, and he's now gotten his second wind. So what happens is you're cranking and your arm's getting tired, and now you're cranking and you're doing like this, and well, I made a little bird nest there, but that's okay. Just for demonstration purposes, you're kind of doing this, and you're tired, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna get one more turn on that fish and one more turn on that fish. And what happens is your wrist gets weak. It's not out here anymore. You start rolling it in, and when you roll it in like that, you hit the star drag. And now as you get that extra turn, you just took that star drag and turned it a quarter turn. Now you do that 2 or 3 times, now your drag setting that was at say 7 or 8 or 10 or whatever it was, now it's up at around 18 or something. And then all of a sudden, I'm gonna get one more, now you're at 20, and you didn't realize that you were doing it, and all of a sudden that fish comes up and does a head shake or a jump, and you go to bow to him, and it doesn't matter. There's not enough give there, and pow, he breaks off. And that is the most demeaning feeling in the world after you put 45 minutes into a fish to have him jump one last time and bust the line. And you're like, how the heck did he break the line? And you go, I'll come over and I'll go to pull on it, and it'll be cranked down tight as it can be. So with this type of a reel, you cannot do that, because once you get to your preset setting, you're pretty much there. You can't go any farther. I did a good one. So that setting right there is where you want it to be pretty much most of the time. There we go. I got it out. Now I want to talk about the type of line that I use on this reel, because I talked about the braided line that I use on the spinning reel. I don't use braided line on my conventional reels on top. On that reel, I have an undershot of monofilament with a top shot of about 150 yards of braided line. On this, I do exactly the opposite. I have about 200 yards of bottom shot with about 150 yards of top shot, 30 on here. And I'm using 30-pound fluorocarbon line. And the reason that I'm using the fluorocarbon line, there's a little less stretch to it than there is with monofilament. And so you can feel what the fish is going to do a little better. You can feel the head shakes. You can feel the tail kicks. You can feel when he's getting ready to come up. With monofilament, a lot of times you lose a little bit of that sensitivity because of the stretch in it. You can't tell what that fish is doing, and they can catch you by surprise. The second thing is fluorocarbon line is almost invisible. And the really cool thing about that is this is 30 pound. Remember, we've got to get to 60 or 80, right? Because we need a leader. Now on my I only use live bait on this type, well, not always, but I primarily use live bait on this type of a setup. There's my knot. And I use an Albright knot. So I go from 30 to, this is actually 60 because I was fishing it down in the Keys last with this rod. And so I went with a little bit lighter leader and a 7/0 circle hook or so. So the knot going through the water makes a bubble trail. It looks like a glass minnow. I don't know if you guys can see that. I don't know if you can see that knot right there, but it's about a 1/4 inch long and about a 1/16 of an inch in diameter. That Albright knot. And it looks like a glass minnow going through the water. Well, guess what likes to eat glass minnows? Your buddy and mine, the 1.5 pound Spanish mackerel. And so you're hooked up on that tarpon and all of a sudden, bink, the line goes slack. What the heck just happened? That little 1.5 pound Spanish mackerel decided that your knot looked good enough to eat. And there goes your tarpon. And you lose him. So with the fluorocarbon versus the monofilament, it's not quite as visible in the water. And I've seen in the last 2 years, it seems like I'm getting less cutoffs right at the knot. So I'm a big fan of not getting broken off, not by an angler error. Angler error, it happens, When it's not an angler error and it's either an equipment failure or you get help, one of the tarpon's buddies got help from one of his cousins there, Mr. Spanish Mackerel. That's frustrating. That's very frustrating. The other thing that you'll notice is when your line is cutting through the water, it's creating a bubble trail. If you have Spanish mackerel in the area where you're fishing and you're tarpon fishing, the second that you hook a fish, put your rod tip down in the water. If he jumps, bring it up. But put it back down. While he's zipping around and going crazy, the Spanish mackerel are going to be chasing that and they're going to cut you off. So just put it down underneath the water, that way it's not cutting through the water. So 2 ways to not get cut off. A, use fluorocarbon line, and B, when it's zipping through, just put it down and let it stay down. And it's easier said here than it is when you're out on the boat and you're in the heat of battle. And you just hooked that 70-pound fish and he went airborne 3 times and now he's making a 100-yard run across the bow. It's real easy to say to do all that, but you just have to do it enough to remember that, hey, I've got to get this rod tip down so that I don't lose that fish. So let's talk a little bit about any questions on this particular gear. I didn't really talk about the rod. The rod's a 30 to 60-pound class rod, and I use a 7 to 7.5 foot composite. I like the composite rods better than the all glass rods. They're a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to hold on to, and I like ones that have a really long foregrip because sometimes you're sitting there doing this for a while that fish is going crazy, and then you can get back to it. But as long as you've got a nice long foregrip and you can get both hands up there, and then you've got a rod, some kind of a rod butt, whether it be a hookie or any of those little ball adapters or a regular rod belt, you've got something to hold on to. So I like a longer foregrip on my conventional stuff. Yes. Yeah, you kind of turn it over. Yeah. Or braid can be really bad if you get a big loop in it. So, you know, you will lose more fish on the spinning rod than you will on the conventional rod due to a tip wrap type scenario, because the braid has a tendency to do that much more quickly than this does, and it's harder to see when it does it. You can see it pretty easily in this, but in that it's not as easy. So yeah, but yes, you want to try, and what I'll do is I'll stab, and if I can roll it over and then bring it back up into me like that. Because that way you're getting the guides facing the tarpon. So that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, any questions on that, guys? Let's talk about gear. There's only one hook that you need to worry about buying whenever you buy hooks, and that is a VMC 7385 circle hook. And that hook is by far, out of all of the hooks I've ever used, by far the best tarpon hook that I've ever used. There's two reasons. One, it's very thin. It's made out of a steel called vanadium steel, and it's a very thin steel, so you get good penetration. You have to think, a tarpon's mouth, try and get a hook to go in the gel coat of that boat. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to drive a hook through basically something that's about as hard as a cinder block. So the smaller the diameter, the easier it can penetrate. And with that vanadium steel, it's an extremely strong steel, small diameter, it's forged, so it's kind of mashed on the sides. It's not round, it's kind of flattened on the sides. And all of those things add to the penetration factor of that particular hook. Now, VMC has just come out with a new hook, and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see there's 5 in here. I better get it back with 5. This new hook has something very special on it. If you'll look down about halfway down the bend, there's a little black dot, and there is a little, I'll pull one out. I can trust you guys. There is a little piece of monofilament on it. And this is a little bait stop, that little thing right there. So you put your bait on here, and then it can't slide up any farther past that little piece of mono and that little glue. So it can't go, like if you hook a bait sideways through the nose and you're slow trolling with it, or you've pitched it, the first thing the bait does is turn and runs away. Well, when it does that, the hook kind of does something funny and rolls around, and then it'll like roll back into itself like that. And then it doesn't matter if the tarpon bites it or not, you can't get a hook up because the hook's pointing back into the bait. So this helps alleviate that, because the bait can't go far enough around for it to then roll back in on himself. He stays back down here in the bottom part of the bend of the hook. So this is something that we worked with those guys for about a year on before they brought it to market. But it was one of the things that I'm really proud of, because I got to help with it to try and solve a problem that we all have, and that is missing fish because the point of the hook got rolled back into our bait again. So that's the same hook. It's called that inline tournament circle, but this one is called the LKCB. So LK, I don't know what LK is. Couldn't tell you. But CB stands for Coastal Black. The Coastal Black is a new finish, and it's better than the black nickel finish that you find on most hooks. Now, they do make a black nickel finish, but this Coastal Black is really, really corrosion resistant. It's almost like they took, remember the Permasteel hooks, the silver Permasteel hooks? It's almost that type of a finish where it doesn't rust for a long time. As long as you rinse it off with fresh water, that is. Anything will rust if you don't rinse it. But you can use these hooks over and over again, which is a really nice thing. Especially because, even though hooks aren't that expensive, they're not that cheap either. And nobody wants to keep having to go buy them if you don't have to. So you'll lose enough to sharks, you'll lose enough to the Spanish mackerel cutting off. You'll lose enough other ways that you don't need them to just be rusting out on you. So that Coastal Black finish, instead of that standard black nickel finish, is a great finish that I like to use. So let's talk about live baits just a little bit. What do you guys like to use for live bait when you're out fishing near shore waters? Shrimp. Okay. What else do you guys like to use?
Whatever you catch.
Yeah, basically. So there's no really right answer for what is a tarpon going to eat and what is he not going to eat. If there's shrimp in the area, like there is in November, December, January, February, and you're fishing down from Sebastian south, and we have one of those warmer than average years like we had this year, and you have tarpon around, they eat shrimp really well. And they eat things that imitate shrimp really well. You can catch them. I've caught them on little saltwater assassin paddle tails before. In fact, 2 years ago, that's about all we were throwing at them was a little saltwater assassin paddle tail, and we just cast it out and just let it sink and pendle them back, and then just slowly start to reel. And every once in a while, just lift the rod tip up, and then lower it back down, and then start reeling again. A real slow retrieve where it was just kind of gliding along, and then kind of went up a little bit, went down a little bit, and then went gliding along again. Tarpon don't really like an erratic retrieve, like snook, redfish, trout. You know, you're working a lure and you're making that thing jig and jog all over the place and look like it's broken or injured or something. And the snook's like, oh, I got to eat that thing, you know, or the redfish is like, oh, look at that, I got to eat it. Tarpon will go, something's not right with that. I'm just going to go over here. I'll see you later. And they don't really like that erratic retrieve. They like a steady, smooth retrieve. And no matter what lure you're using, if you can remember that most of the time, that little rise, that little pause, that little fall will get you, that's all you need to do. You don't need to be jerking it and going crazy with it. So with a jig, and I throw jigs a lot, especially around bait pods, I throw a couple different kinds of jigs. I'll throw a hair jig, and I throw the hair jig more in the pogie pods because pogies have a bigger profile. And I still throw something with a little tail, just a little straight tail to it. And I'll cast it out and I'll just retrieve it. Every once in a while, I just kind of give it just a little lift and a drop, and a little lift and a drop. Not twitching and jerking and doing all that kind of thing. But just a simple Upperman jig like this R&R jig works very, very well. Or this is a Storm Coastal GT bait. And it has a V-tail to it, sort of like, kind of like a Zoom fluke or one of those kind of fluke style baits. But in this pilchard color works really well. I'm throwing it on a 3/4 ounce Bass Assassin head, and that's a really good tarpon bait when they're feeding on glass minnows or greenies or pilchards. It's a little bigger than a glass minnow. They actually have one that's a little bit smaller that I use whenever I'm throwing in the glass minnow pods, and then this bigger one when I'm throwing around greenie pods or pilchard pods. But that is, once again, a fantastic bait to throw. Be careful because that hook's sharp, it got me. It's a fantastic bait to throw whenever you're fishing in that type of a bait pod scenario. And last but not least, if the water's dirty, I go with a real high vis color, either bright white, like the color of this gentleman's shirt, a nice, real vibrant white, or an alewife, or a pearl white, or this lime truce. And same thing, just a jig head, just slowly swimming it back. This will also work around bait pods, but I find that the bluefish will tear these things up if you get around like a pogie pod that's got bluefish on it. You'll just burn through these. So don't do that. Just go back to like the hair jig or something that's a hard bait rather than throw these things, because they're not cheap. But they do work really well. And these are great cobia baits. If you've ever seen, Blair Wiggins does a show called Addictive Fishing. And if you've ever seen the show that we did, I think he named it Cobia-licious or something like that. I forgot the exact name of it. But we were using these on that show and doing really well, on the cobia. So you can kind of see the way that they kind of flutter in the water. The straight tail baits, even though they don't have a paddle tail to have a big swinging action, they still have a little bit of a wiggling action to it. And that seems to really entice tarpon a lot. So in the case of cobia, I will work it much more aggressively, but in the case of tarpon, just that straight retrieve is what you want. Now, if you don't want to cast, you don't want to try and mess around with bait, you don't want to do any of that, I just want to troll and try and catch a tarpon. You can do that. Very easy. You take the trolling rod, the conventional rod with a lever drag, and you can either get any kind of a heavier mullet imitation like this, and you can slow troll this up and down the beach, especially effective in the fall time when the mullet are swimming up and down the beach. Or something like that shad wrap that I had pulled out before. Now this one looks like a pogey. It's got the dot on it and everything. And I did change out that back hook to a 6/0, what's called an ILS. VMC makes this hook. It's called an ILS for inline single. They come in 6/0. Well, they come in any size from about a number 4 all the way up to a 9/0. But in this particular case, I try to match the size of the bait and the size of the hook that came off of it. So that 6/0 seems to work really well. Treble on the front still. It's a 4X treble that's on there. But you can simply troll this and catch fish while you're trolling up and down the beach. And I typically look for the tarpon in that 15 to 25 foot depth. This bait will, most of the time this bait will troll down to about 8 or 10 feet. So it's just on the upper side of where they're going to be if you find them in 25 feet of water. I should have probably started with where to look for tarpon, or had it somewhere closer to the front, but let's talk about it because we're kind of towards the end now. Tarpon like to be in relatively shallow water. Why? Because there's bigger sharks the deeper you go, and they do have predators. I actually had a tarpon eaten last year, and I can't confirm nor deny it, but I think it got eaten by a great white, because I've had sharks get eaten by hammerheads. I've had sharks get eaten by bull sharks. Bull sharks are normally pack feeders. There's normally 2 or 3 of them, and they'll come and they'll take bites out of them, and it takes a while for them to eat an 80-pound tarpon. Hammerheads will drive the fish up to the surface and then try and bite his tail or his backbone so that they disable him, and now he's crippled, and then the rest of them will just kind of float there in the water, and they can come back around and take another bite. Whatever ate this tarpon on me last year, it was like me eating a tater tot. I mean, it was gone. It wasn't taking, let me get a bite out of this. It ate the whole thing. So it was big. And it wasn't very far off of Satellite Beach. I was only about a quarter mile off the beach. And there were sharks pinging in the area, other sharks pinging, great whites pinging in the area at that time. So my logical conclusion was I had a close encounter with one of them. I couldn't see it because we were looking into the sun. The fish had done its couple of jumps and he was heading offshore, which is one of the things that a bigger tarpon will do. It'll kind of start heading for deeper water. And all of a sudden it lost its mind. It acted like somebody lit his tail on fire, and then there was a big old giant swirl, splash, commotion, and then nothing but red, just blood in the water, and that was it. Gone. Popped the line, everything. I mean, it's like, you want to talk about getting some goosebumps on your arm? The hair on the back of your neck standing up? When you see a fish as big as me that just got eaten like me eating a tater tot, let me tell you something. Puts things in a whole new perspective. My Skeeter 24-footer was way too small for me to be in that part of the ocean at that particular time. So we went up the beach a little ways, and then we put some baits back out again. But so most of the time, though, tarpon like to stay in less than about 25 feet of water. If you're looking for them, look for them in that 15 to 25 foot range. And this bait, like I'm saying, going down about 8 feet. If you're in 15 feet of water, that's about halfway down in the water column. And that's where the tarpon are typically holding, is about halfway down. You'll see them come up, they'll roll, they'll gulp some air, and then they'll go back down to about that depth again. If they're out in 25 feet of water, then they're generally down about 12 to 15 feet down. The only exception to that I've found is when you've got a high pressure scenario, they'll get real close to the bottom. They'll be within 3 or 4 feet of the bottom. And that's where you'll mark them on your sounder or your side scan, that kind of thing. So, you just want a lure that you can put in front of their nose whenever possible. And so something about the size of a menhaden that's got a lip that dives it to 8 feet or so, you can just troll down the beach. Now, you don't just troll down the beach. You need to zigzag, especially important with tarpon. Now, I know you guys that dolphin fish, you're out there and you're doing that zigzag once in a while, especially if you're going down a rip. It brings your outside bait, makes it speed up, and your inside bait kind of slows down, and then that outside bait speeds up as you're zigging back the other way, and the inside bait slows down. So especially on calm days, you're creating more action in your spread by speeding up and slowing down your lures. Do the same thing with these lures. Have one short and have one long, and troll in a zigzag pattern. And when I mean short, I mean 75 feet, 80 feet, and then your long bait can be 150 or so feet behind the boat. But just zigzag so that you're not really making the lures speed up and slow down. In that case, because you really don't have them like on outriggers, I troll them from my gunnels. But what happens is, if you're a tarpon and you're a tarpon and I run right down here with my boat, you go out. The tarpon go out around your boat, and then they'll probably stay out there. They're not necessarily going to come right back in right away. So if I'm zigging and zagging as I come around this side, but my baits are still here, they're dragging through where those guys are at, and then I can cut back across and I can go across that side, and then you guys, I won't be really running into you, but my baits will, as I'm making that curve over there, my baits will come through here. So it's about presentation with the bait and not disturbing the fish with the boat. So I'll zig and zag about from here to maybe the second Bennington boat over there, which is probably 50 yards or so. So I'll come this way, and then I'll come back that way, and I'll do about a 50-yard zigzag. And that typically when I'm making my turn and coming back the other way, and the bait is coming through the area that I went here, and then I'm getting down here, my bait's now out in front of that. That's where I typically get my bite, is in between sort of if you're making a sideways sine wave, it's in the straight. It's not, you'll be in the turn, but the bait will be in the straight. And that's generally when you get your bite, when you're trolling. So that would be my big recommendation for you guys and gals to, if you're just trolling, and it's a great way to search. If you're not seeing fish rolling, or maybe there's only one that rolls here, maybe one that rolls there, but you're marking fish, and especially if you're marking them on your sounder, that's a great way to get the fish to respond to you without having to put a lot of time in. You can kind of zigzag up and down the beach, and you'll find that aggressive fish as you pull baits past them. So basically that's my presentation. Hopefully you guys and gals enjoyed it. Like I said, my name's Jim Ross. Do my fine line fishing charters. Myself and my son have a charter business. We do Catch a Memory Outdoors radio show live every Saturday from 7 to 9 a.m. You're more than welcome to tune in. The information is on the back of the brochures that I handed out. And if you guys are interested in getting out on the water and doing some tarpon fishing, we'd love to hear from you. We've got May and June are the two best months to catch tarpon in the springtime, and then again in September and October they're good in the fall. So if you're looking to go, those would be the times that I would pick out to try and get a charter on, and Justin and I can definitely help you out, try and get your tarpon tactics set up. Or if you just want to go catch one, you never caught one before, we can definitely try and help you get your first one. We really appreciate you. Yes, sir.
I just had a question about any canals for the 2, 3.
The little ones?
Yeah. Well, what's the best presentation?
So you see this Bass Assassin 7-inch bait?
Yeah.
Buy a 3-inch in the baby bass color and rig it on a 1/8 or a 1/16 ounce jig head or an offset weedless worm hook with a weighted worm hook with a little screw lock on the front of it. But the little 3-inch size in the baby bass or the pearl white. The pearl white was working better in January and February. Justin was crushing them on that. I didn't do a lot of that fishing. I did a little bit of it, but I pretty much was using the baby bass for the most part.